All throughout this module, we've been talking about nature and music. We've been looking at sounds of birds and natural environments, looking at waveforms and the sound spectrum. And we've expanded that into an understanding of our own hearing range. And then we got into a little bit about recording and how we convert recordings into digital audio and back. For this last lesson of this module, we're going to talk about one more element of sort of pulling apart the threads of what makes music and sound, and that is periodicity. This is one of the major ways that we can distinguish noisy sounds from pitched sounds. And so we're going to be talking about that, and our model for this is going to be speech. Not only is the human voice used sometimes in music, but it's also our main model for understanding language and understanding each other. And the human languages contain a lot of both noise and pitch sounds, and it's a good model for us to get started. So let's go. We begin our discussion of periodicity by thinking about periodic versus aperiodic waves. Aperiodic is the same as non-periodic. So thinking about these waveforms that we've been looking at, when we looked at the hummingbird waveform, we saw a shape that repeated in time. That's a periodic waveform. So if there's a consistent shape, or mostly consistent shape, that repeats in time, that's a period, and so it's a periodic waveform. An aperiodic waveform does not have a repeating shape, and instead it is random amplitudes and more of a random shape. So periodic sounds are what creates our impression of a sustained pitch. So a periodic sound like a voice, ah, or an instrument playing a note, or even a sustained vowel in speech, or any sound that has a consistent pitch or semi-consistent pitch is a periodic waveform. An aperiodic waveform relates to noise. So noise is more like random frequencies at random times, and the aperiodic waveforms create those noisy sounds. Let's look at an example now from speech. So this example here shows some different speech sounds as waveforms. So these are just like the waveforms we've been looking at, where the center here, there's no line, but the center is 0, and we're going above to 1 and down below toward -1. These symbols here are International Phonetic Alphabet symbols for phonemes. Phonemes are individual speech sounds. So this first one is an H sound. When we create an H sound, it's a noisy sound, and it's not a pitch. It's more of just air. That sound you can see here is an aperiodic waveform. You don't see any necessarily repeating patterns. In fact, you see more like random points above and below, still oscillating, of course, above and below the center line, but not at any predictable height or volume, and not in any predictable repeating pattern or pitch. The three below are vowel sounds. So this is an E sound, this is an A sound, this is an A sound. You see that in each of these, even though they look different, they do have some repeating structure, and the repeating structures are marked with these lines. Those are marking the periods. So the period, making it a periodic sound, is the repeating shape from one point to another. So you can see how, even though the shapes are very different, they're all periodic sounds. Certain parts of speech are aperiodic or periodic. I chose a random word, scoot, S-C-O-O-T, to show the phonemes. So this word scoot could be written out as phonemes if we take the individual phonemes and separate them. S, k, u, and t. Even though it's a single syllable word in English, there are 4 phonemes here. S, k, u, t. So the consonants, s, k, and t, are all aperiodic, just like the H we saw above. These consonant sounds are aperiodic waves, so they are noise. S is a sibilant sound, a sustained noise, whereas the K and T are called plosives. The K and T are, of course, short sounds with a burst of air at the beginning. So we're going to look at this as a waveform now. Scoot. Oot. So at the beginning here, I said it just as a regular word, but then I spread it out so we could look at each waveform. So the S sound here, as we zoom in, we see some movement above and below the line, but just notice how we don't see a particular repeating shape. We can kind of scroll through the rest of this, and you just see movement above and below, not with a repeating pattern. The K sound has this plosive element at the beginning, and again, we do see it going above and below the line, but not with a consistent shape that repeats in time. Notice these jagged, noisy shapes here and random frequencies. Whereas the oo is a periodic waveform. Ooh. We zoom in on the oo, we see this shape right here. It looks kind of like a mountain, and it repeats over and over again. And you remember that the frequency is how often this cycle happens per second. So we could figure that out, but for now we're just focused on the difference between this periodic waveform and these aperiodic waveforms. The T at the end was also an aperiodic waveform. So periodic is pitched and aperiodic is noise. Music relates to speech. Of course, there are rhythmic elements to speech, but of course we know that when we sing songs, we stretch out the periodic elements of the words, also known as the vowels. So we still sing the consonants short, like we do when we're talking, but then we stretch out the vowels, the periodic waveforms, so we can sing pitches. It might be interesting to speak the text of a favorite song of yours in the same rhythm as it's sung, but just speak it without singing. And of course you would notice that it's really stretched out on all of the vowels. All right, I dug up the original scoot. I have no idea why I picked this word, but here we go. We looked at it in the waveform and talked about the periodicity and the aperiodicity, and I thought as a last thing it'd be great to look at it in the spectrum. So in the spectrogram, here we can see the full word again, just if you're curious to look back at the waveform. This is what we saw up here on the top, and down at the bottom we're going to see the spectrum. So let's listen to it again. Scoot. Scoot. Okay, and so the same elements of periodicity and aperiodicity that we saw in the waveform when we zoomed in are present here. And this will be a good last thing for this module to bridge us into the next module where we'll talk about partials. But for our purposes right now, what we can see is on the aperiodic noisy sounds like s, we see a big sort of random, cloud, which kind of makes sense for the way we hear the word or the sound S as a big cloud, but this is what we'll call broadband or a very saturated sound. So remember that over here on the right we have frequencies, and you probably can't see this without zooming way in, but down around here is 1,000 hertz, and up here is 10,000 hertz. So notice how this S sound exists very, very high up. This is almost above the range of the piano. And yet you could think about it like maybe it has kind of like every pitch, or really more realistically, it's random pitches, but they're random pitches happening up very high, or random frequencies, I should say. And then let's hear the other sounds again. So notice the k sound is also random, but it's shorter, of course. And there are these kind of areas of focus, and that's how my mouth is filtering the sound on the letter K. We're going to learn more all about this kind of stuff, but notice how dense, saturated, and cloudy it is. And then here comes the periodic sound. Ooh. Okay, so a little bit of noise up here. I actually think this is kind of my breath and the sound of my mouth, but mostly we see a focusing, just like we saw a focusing in the waveform, it being predictable and like this repeating mountain shape over and over again. We see in the spectrogram, we see more consistent pitches and a concentration of those pitches, or I should say frequencies. Pitches are perception of frequencies. So it's concentrated. Ooh. Right? And we can, next time we'll be learning about harmonics and talking about what these different lines mean. But notice how different it looks than these other consonants. So you can compare K and T. They're very, very similar, but notice how the T stretches all the way up and it's extremely short. Now I stretched out the K, of course, but here it, again, is the full word, and I think it's worth noting how it really helps to stretch things out so we can see, even though the same thing is happening over here, it's just much shorter, and here's going to be the ooh. Scoot. The distinction that I made between periodic and aperiodic sounds is true, that periodic sounds are, for the most part, pitched, and aperiodic sounds are, for the most part, noisy. As I was making this course, there are many of these crossroads where I have to decide whether to say something simply and run the risk of potentially having a 1% counter argument, or say in a more complex or vague way. So it is possible to have a periodic wave that is not really pitched from our perspective, and vice versa. It's possible to have an aperiodic sound that appears pitched to our perception. For example, subtractive synthesis, where you heavily filter some noise. Anyway, there are going to be many things like this in the course where I've mostly chosen to say them in a simple way because I really believe in that, and because they're mostly true. Exceptions can be found, and I'm happy to hear from you all about those exceptions. And the last thing I wanted to say about periodicity is how this relates to music. Of course, obviously we have voices in music sometimes, but other instruments. What about other instruments? Are they periodic or aperiodic? The simple answer to that question is both. Every instrument that I can think of has both periodic and aperiodic sounds, just like the voice, although maybe the balance is different. For example, when a trumpet player hits a trumpet note, the sustained sound is very periodic. Of course, that's the note that we hear. But the trumpet, like almost every other instrument, has what we call attack transients, or short sounds that happen right at the beginning of the attack, where we might have just a burst of breath sound through the horn. And that breath sound, just like in speech, is going to be an aperiodic sound. So as we get into next module with timbre, we're going to start to look at the specifics of how instruments differentiate themselves in the sound spectrum. And what we will find is a different balance for each instrument, but each instrument will contain some aperiodicity, along with the main periodic waves that they produce. I'll see you in the next module. Thank you.